Have you ever been to a concert where you can tell the performer has really given a lot of thought to the choice of music they're choosing to share with you? A really good programme can entice the listener, drawing them in and stringing them along a musical journey, leaving them hanging on your every word or every note. Whereas a bad recital programme can leave audience members checking their watches, questioning what they're doing with their lives, and make them yearn to get home and watch that paint dry. Obviously, when you're younger, you only have a certain amount of music that you play, but as we progress and learn more and more repertoire, programming becomes a fine art all of its own. Knowing how to present a range of music that showcases you as a player and your love for the instrument is really important. Hello, and welcome back to episode 3 of Chiff Chat. Yep, I still make these. So today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I think makes a good organ recital programme. There's no perfect way to do it, but there are plenty of bad ways. I first realised how important it was to get programming right when I gave an end-of-year recital as an organ scholar. Some of my friends were in the audience, and at the end they gave me a standing ovation. Afterwards, I went up and said, "Oh, thanks for that, that's really appreciated." And one of them said, "Oh no, we were just so bored, we had to get up and stretch our legs." So today I'll be sharing and suggesting some things that I myself have done in the past, hopefully not in a condescending way, and we'll look at some sample programmes to see if we can try and diagnose the good, the bad and the ugly. I suppose a lot of the following stuff could be applied generally to any instrument, but organ recitals are a bit different in that every organ is unique, so repertoire needs to be carefully chosen to suit a range of factors. But first, before we start, a quick word from today's sponsor. No, I'm just joking, there's no sponsor. Let's get on with it. So, first of all, as I said, when you're just starting out on the organ, maybe you've been playing for a few years, you might only have a dozen or so pieces under your belt. Perhaps some of them you've played for grade exams. If asked to give a recital, you may just be tempted to put down everything you play. While there's nothing inherently wrong with this in the early stages, it shouldn't be relied on as a default. It's a really good idea to introduce new repertoire into your programmes steadily, as it can be quite nerve-wracking playing a new piece in public for the first time, but the adrenaline of a concert setting will help you get through it. So even if it's not note perfect, just getting over that mental hurdle will mean that it's far more familiar if you programme it again in the future. It's important to say as well that not every piece you play in concert has to stretch you to your limits. A couple of easier pieces sprinkled in will help to make sure you pace yourself and have enough mental bandwidth for the more intensive works. I've tried to work out a good way to structure this video a million times and I just can't do it. So this might be a bit rambly, but hopefully it makes some sort of sense and you can follow along. So here we go. So, things to consider. The organ you're going to play. Think about who made the instrument and therefore what types of music will work best on it. Is it mechanical or electric action? Does it have general pistons, a sequencer, a stepper, playing aids? What's the acoustic like? Think also about the setting or location. Is it in a church, concert hall, someone's front room? This might influence the type of repertoire you perform. I can't stress enough how important this is. Seems obvious to say, but a church on a bustling high street with a midweek lunchtime recital series will draw a different crowd to somewhere that's, say, more out the way with a monthly evening recital series, where the audiences tend to be a little bit more hardcore. Evening recitals tend to be a bit longer too, so Vienna symphonies and the Roydke Sonata are a bit more at home here. Basically, if you turn up to a light, frothy lunchtime recital series where Edna and Mavis are eating their sandwiches, and you play a Sorabji symphony, I think it's fair to say you've probably not really read the room. That's not to say you can't challenge these kinds of audiences with a piece that's a bit out there, but by and large it's best to pitch it just right, perhaps by looking at what previous recitalists have played there. Everyone will have various levels of comfort at different instruments. For example, an organ like this requires quite a different skill set and mindset to this. There's no way you try to force a Howell psalm prelude to work on this. in the same way you might think twice about programming a Bach trio sonata on whatever this is. In a piece where the dynamics change often, you'll have to get used to the layout of a new instrument and build that into rehearsal time, so that's worth bearing in mind. But if you do your research and look up the specification online beforehand, when you get to the console for your practice time, you'll already have done a lot of the mental preparation. On a related note, sometimes you might put down something that you don't actually play yet in order to force you to learn it. It's a good, albeit pressurised way to learn new stuff, although you have to be the right kind of person to do it, not leaving things till the last minute. Make sure you can play the piece at least a week before the live performance. Right, before we look at some examples, just a few quick-fire tips and things that I couldn't get to fit in anywhere else. This one's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Final movements of symphonies or sonatas are often really flashy, but don't let that be the first thing the audience hears. Similarly, don't finish the recital with the first movement of something. It just makes it seem as if you don't know whether you're coming or going. Unless you're making a point of doing a complete 180 to reset or restart the program, it's important to try and place pieces next to each other that have some sort of key relationship. Obviously, playing 3 pieces in G major in a row is already boring, but maybe starting in G major, going to D minor, F major, and then perhaps a tertiary relationship to A flat major. Obviously, this isn't always possible, and in fact, it's very rare where all the planets align and you get a program you're happy with that magically also works with the key relationships. But if you can avoid doing one piece in C major and then immediately following it with a piece in D flat major, it'll go a long way to strengthening the musical narrative you're weaving over the course of your recital. This is really important. To convince your audience that you're not just playing a random set of pieces, it's important to get a good sense of flow. Obviously, when you're on an unfamiliar organ, you need to take the time between pieces to make sure you're all ready to go and check you're on the right channel, etc. But try and practice the turnaround time in your practice sessions. Of course, you need to factor in a few moments to reset between pieces, maybe 30 seconds, but don't go out for a sandwich, otherwise audience retention might falter a bit. On the flip side, it can be occasionally really nice to launch straight from one piece to another. Another example, I recently heard someone go from the quiet ending of Liszt Resignazione into the boisterous pedal solo of Franck's Finale. As it turns out, I don't really like either of those pieces, but the link really drew me in and helped me form a greater connection between the similar late 19th century idiom of those two works. A load of short pieces in a row will make the audience feel breathless, like they've just run a beep test, whereas exclusively long pieces can be a bit fatiguing. Try and think of it like a menu at a restaurant. If you've just had the filling roast dinner, you're not going to want to go in for a curry and 4 naan straight afterwards. Having said that though, funnily enough, the best programme I've ever done, in my opinion, was Minimalist. It only had 3 pieces in it, but they were all about 20 minutes each. The Bach Zeige partita, the Alain Trois Danses, and the Kargelert Passacaglia on BACH. I really liked the Bach and BACH bookend link, and the fact that they're both essentially sets of variations means that there was constantly something fresh for the audience's earbuds. And the quirky Alain in the middle is in 3 movements and worked as a good stylistic foil to the outer pieces. Some composers go really well next to each other, some don't, and some it just depends on the piece. I once put a relatively diatonic piece of Messiaen after a particularly chromatic bit of Buxtehude, and it worked surprisingly well. To go with a food analogy again, playing Couperin followed by Howells is a bit like having caviar and then eating Monster Munch. No, that's a rubbish example. It's more like when you've just brushed your teeth and it's all minty, but then you have a glass of orange juice. It's just gross. Basically, just try not to give your audience whiplash by darting around different time periods and styles too much. You can do a whole programme with just a single composer, especially if it's someone universally loved like Bach, as long as there's enough variety between pieces. But just tread carefully. If an audience member doesn't like Reger, and you play a full 60 minutes of Reger, they're going to feel a little bit alienated, however well you play. Before COVID closed everything down in 2020, I was going to put on a series of Vienne recitals celebrating his 150th anniversary. I aim to do 4 concerts, each with one of the Pièce de Fantaisie suites, but aware that this might be Vienne overload, I was sure to couple each set with works on the periphery or tangentially related to the subject. Works dedicated to Vienne, works by Vienne's contemporaries, some of Vienne's transcriptions of other composers. So while the focus was squarely on the man himself, there was other stuff going on too. The recitals never happened in the end, but I stuck most of it up on YouTube, which you can listen to if you want to, on my VN 150 playlist. I'm not saying you have to do something gimmicky that doesn't gel well with the rest of the recital, but with the best will in the world, you can go to several recitals of Bach, Howells and Vienne and come away thinking, yeah, that was good, but I'm not really going to remember it. I do remember going to a recital in a church with a Baroque-style organ in Boston, and while most of the programme was Stone Age music, there was one modern piece the recitalist played that involved fast-moving cluster chords, which messed with the winding and required some of the stops to be half-drawn, which created really eerie harmonic overtones. The piece ended with a held chord on full organ, then the instrument was switched off, which gave this effect. And that's the kind of thing that really sticks with you. And on that note, put yourself in the shoes of the audience member and ask yourself what works and what doesn't about your oral experience. Was there a particular link between two pieces or composers that you hadn't considered before that you thought worked particularly well? And did the recitalist hold your attention or prick up your ears with a piece you've not encountered before? So, all of the things being equal, here are my thoughts on a classically strong organ recital programme, and we'll put together a sample programme too. We need a flashy opener, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Let's go for the Sinfonia to Cantata No. 29 by Bach, arranged by Dupré. A less impressive but still substantial audience-friendly piece, maybe the Bach Prelude and Fugue in A major, BWV 536. Now you've got the audience on side, something large-scale that demonstrates you can handle a piece with a big architecture and manage the organ that you're playing on. How about the Introduction, Passacaglia and Fugue by Healy-Willan? Something modern or unexpected, perhaps that's a bit challenging to listen to, perhaps something the audience didn't know they wanted. I mentioned it in Chiff Chat episode 1, let's go for Harpe de Marie by Florence. Some sort of scherzo or light-hearted sorbet to soften the impact of the previous piece, maybe Phantasmagorie by Jean Alain. Something quiet and lyrical, the calm before the storm. Perhaps Cantabile by Franck, it's his anniversary year, so why not? And finally, a dazzling firework display to leave the audience wanting more, such as the final movement of Vienne's 6th Symphony. Now, that sort of programme obviously isn't transferable to every situation, and as we've already said, organ, length of programme, audience are all factors. But my point is that if you can cover all those bases in one recital, nobody can argue that you didn't include enough variety. Alright, let's say you're presented with a Baroque-style organ with draw stops and no pistons. There are a few combination pedals, but you're going to have to largely rely on a registration assistant or your own wits. What do you do? Let's say, for the sake of argument, we're going to stick entirely in the Baroque idiom, which is a completely rational thing to do. Well, consider all the types of Baroque form: large-scale preludes and fugues, trios, ornamented chorale preludes, partitas, passacaglias, tierces entiers, manuals-only pieces, there's loads. We could open with something like Dic Nobis Maria by Scheidemann, the closest we can get to a transcription from the Baroque era. It's based on a motet by Italian composer Giovanni Bassano. Carrying on the Italianate theme, we'll keep the momentum going with a short trio movement. Herr Jesu Christ is nice and bite-sized and sort of Pentecost-themed, leading on quite well from the Easter-themed Scheidemann. Something gentler after this, like Vater Unser by Bohm, a chance to show off lyrical playing in the coloratura line, perhaps with a beautiful solo stop. After this, we've reached about halfway through the recital, so the audience might be drooping a bit. Something to keep them on their toes is needed now. There's a crazy piece by Tarquinio Merilla with a fully chromatic fugue subject. Sounds particularly nice if your Baroque organ is in a non-equal temperament. Having given the right hand a workout in the Vater Unser, now it's the left hand's turn in something like a Ties en Taille by Couperin or de Grigny. Then a big scale prelude and fugue to finish. Aside from Bach, I'd always plump for Buxtehude. He's often a little more off the wall, and the Stilus Fantasticus can be really thrilling as a conclusion. Or consider this, how about a palindromic programme? We'll try this with just Bach works. Bach himself would often open a recital with a prelude and finish with a fugue. So let's start with that. We could conceivably stick a whole trio sonata in the middle of the programme, leaving 2 gaps either side for smaller pieces, perhaps 1 chorale prelude and 1 miscellaneous work. Schmucke Dich is a really popular favourite, and for the second slot, maybe the Kleines Harmonisches Labyrinth, in which Bach tries to get through as many keys as possible in about 3 minutes. Key scheme works pretty well here, and lengthwise, it's got a good balance of shorter and more substantial pieces. And just for good measure, here's an example of a bad programme. No one's debating that the Bach preludes aren't brilliant, but this sort of programme proves there can be too much of a good thing. Sometimes it's quite nice to get inventive with your programming. I once had an idea for a recital that went from darkness to light. Here it is printed here. Let me briefly explain the thinking behind it, and then we'll pick it apart. The Tournemire is part of L'Orgue Mystique for the Office of Trinity Sunday, and it's based on Iam Sol Recedit, the Vespers hymn, Now the Sun is Setting. And although it starts loudly, the whole movement's a diminuendo, so it's like a musical sunset. This is followed by Kargelert, the Sun's Evensong, which sort of speaks for itself. Now, the Buxtehude Passacaglia has something to do with the moon, I promise. I'll let Wikipedia explain it.
Buxtehude's lifelong interest in numerology is exhibited in the Passacaglia's intricate structure. The numbers 4 and 7 are the foundation of the entire piece. The ostinato pattern is composed of 7 notes in 4 bars, and it appears 28 times. 4 times 7 equals 28. There are 4 sections, each 28 bars long. The non-thematic bars, 3 interludes each 3 bars long. An upbeat bar at the beginning and the last bar for the final chord add up to 11. 4 plus 7 equals 11. These numerical aspects have attracted some attention from scholars, and are explained variously as astronomical concepts. The 4 sections referring to the 4 principal phases of the moon, i.e. first quarter, full moon, last quarter, a new moon.
Bit more Kargelert next, Clair de Lune, Light of the Moon. The Howl Psalm Prelude has the text, Yea, the darkness is no darkness with thee, but the night is as clear as the day. The darkness and light to thee are both alike. Bit of a tenuous link, I know, but let's keep going. Wacket auf by Bach, telling people to wake up, literally, in the case of this recital. And then finishing off with Hollins and Vienne, with the sun coming out, the end. At the time, I was really proud of this programme, and there are still some things I like about it. The darkness to light thing is a bit superficial, I'll give you that. But I think there's just enough narrative thread from piece to piece to maintain interest. Okay, so here's the things I don't like about it. There are 2 Baroque pieces just plonked in amidst a load of romantic and 20th century stuff. So that creates a bit of an awkward gear shift. The key scheme is honestly all over the place. We've got a transition from E flat minor to D minor, from E flat major to E major. It's just not nice. Also, the Tournemire actually comes at the end of a suite, and what did I say earlier about starting with final pieces? Final movements of symphonies or sonatas are often really flashy, but don't let that be the first thing the audience hears. Although I'm going to give myself a bit of slack here, because the Tournemire starts loud but finishes quietly. The takeaway from this is a cautionary tale. By all means theorise an inventive programme, but double check the ideology doesn't clash with the overall musical impact. The theme has to work with the instrument and have flow to it, and sometimes what seems good on paper shouldn't necessarily make it onto the keyboard. Here are a few more examples. Another one I've considered doing before is a whole load of pieces with the same title, but again, that soon ended up on the cutting room floor. Think about all the different organ pieces called Pastoral. Franck, Vienne, Ducasse, Bach, Fricker. It doesn't take long before you realise that while the composers inevitably respond differently to the name, ultimately the form and the mood are always going to be quite similar, which doesn't make for varied listening. Liturgical programming can be good for recitals in a church setting, and playing music written specifically for the church can often be a good way for hard-working organists of recycling stuff you've played in services around that time of year, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Some variation of a Pentecost programme often does the rounds at that time of year. De Rufflet and de Grigny Veni Creator, Bach Komm Heiliger Geist, Messiaen Messe la Pentecost, you get the idea. So there are my personal thoughts on what makes a good organ recital programme. Don't want to toot my own cornopian, but I won a prize for my programming in an international organ competition. Nevertheless, if you have something to add to the conversation, maybe you've even been to one of my recitals and think, what's he talking about? Make sure to leave a comment below and let me know what you think makes a really listenable concert programme. I'm really interested to know if people look for the same sort of things that I do. You could be the best organist in the world, but if your programmes don't offer the right kinds of things, then it'll ultimately be harder to communicate the musical message to the listener. It's worth spending the time fine-tuning your choices to suit the organ, audience, and your own abilities. And if you get it right, it'll yield a much more satisfying overall result.